Route 66, State Park in Missouri, is open ground now. Trees, trails, a road, the kind of place that asks for a picnic more than an investigation. But part of that ground used to be Times Beach, a town whose unpaved streets were sprayed with waste oil contaminated with dioxin. After a flood in 1982, federal health authorities said the town should not be re-inhabited. Its residents were permanently relocated. Its buildings and infrastructure entered a long cleanup. So how did something intended to keep dust down end with a town unable to come home? The answer is real, documented, and more unsettling than the legend because it does not need a hidden plot. It runs from oil on the roads to floodwater, from a public health recommendation to a buyout, from a town map to a cleanup record that includes demolition, excavation, treatment, and restoration. It also requires a little precision. Times Beach was not simply set on fire as one undifferentiated toxic object. The official record is stranger in a colder way. A living town became a set of properties, structures, soils, material streams, and finally a landscape no longer inhabited as a town. Times Beach sat in St. Louis County along the Merrimack River. Its setting mattered. A floodplain is not a blank square on a map. It is a place where the ground can move, where water crosses the boundaries, people draw around roads, yards, ditches, and houses. When the federal response came, it was not responding to a spooky roadside rumor. It was responding to samples, to flooding, and to the practical question of whether people could safely return. Go back to the early 1970s. Some of Times Beach's roads were unpaved, and the city used waste oil for dust control. That is the first fact that has to stay in focus. The oil was later established to contain dioxin, including 2, 3, 7, 8 TCDD. A substance used to quiet the dust was being spread over the shared surface people drove across every day. The sources used here do not establish that city officials knew what was in that oil when the dust control work was arranged. They do not give us license to write a villain into the scene. What they do establish is enough. The road treatment created the pathway. The thing meant to make ordinary movement easier had put contamination on the ordinary ground of the town. That is why the road cannot be treated as scenery in this story. It was not merely near the disaster. It was part of the mechanism. The town's streets connected homes, yards, businesses, shoulders, and ditches. They also carried the material at the center of the case. For years, that fact did not yet look like the end of a town. Then came the flood of December 1982. Residents were forced to evacuate. EPA sampling before and after the flood documented the contamination problem, and the flooding spread concern beyond the road surface itself. The water did not create the dioxin. It changed the scale of the problem and the terms on which the town could be judged. After the post-flood findings, the Centers for Disease Control and EPA recommended that Times Beach not be re-inhabited. That phrase has the dry sound of government language. Its meaning was not dry. A temporary evacuation is a disruption. A recommendation against re-inhabitation places a town on the other side of a line. The question is no longer when people will come back, but what happens when they cannot. The response was not immediate demolition. First came the decision to make the evacuation permanent. In February 1983, EPA announced a federal state plan to relocate the town's residents. The official account describes the announcement taking place in a locked conference room at a hotel near Times Beach. Hundreds of residents gathered outside and heard it over loudspeakers. That is the closest the surviving record brings us to the human center of the story, and it is enough. There is a room the public could not enter. There are loudspeakers carrying an announcement out to the people whose town was being discussed. EPA described a buyout of 800 residential properties and 30 businesses, while its cleanup record refers to the permanent relocation of nearly 2,000 residents. The archive does not let us put invented words into the crowd's mouths. It does let us see the shape of the moment, a place full of private lives becoming a public emergency with a price list. No individual resident has to be turned into a character for that scale to register. The cost was not only that people had to leave an address, the ordinary expectation of return had been removed. A road, a flood, a sampling result, and a government advisory had converged on the same outcome. A community could not resume the life that made it a community in the first place. The buyout was also a real administrative machine, not a phrase placed over a map. EPA, FEMA, Missouri, St. Louis County, the city trustee, and other parties appear in the record because homes and businesses had to be acquired before the former town could move into the next phase of the remedy. That is one reason the disappearance of Times Beach took years. A place does not vanish at the instant of an announcement. First, it is emptied of the possibility of normal return. Then, every remaining piece has to be assigned a legal and physical fate. The sources used here do not provide a usable primary record of any particular resident's experience between those institutional actions. They do show federal and state agencies committing money and authority to relocation and the acquired properties passing into public hands. They do not show whether a particular resident saw the buyout as rescue, betrayal, both, or neither. The restraint is important. The people of Times Beach do not need borrowed emotions to establish that the decision placed them under a cost no one in the hotel room could cancel with a speech. That is also where the popular shorthand begins to mislead. It is tempting to say Times Beach was destroyed because its roads were poisonous and leave the picture there, a town leveled and burned after an environmental disaster. The broad outcome is true. Residents were permanently relocated, and the town's built environment was removed or managed during the remedy. But the cleanup was not one theatrical gesture. The documents make it clear that it was a long chain of assigned tasks, material distinctions, and regulated decisions. In 1990, a consent decree set out responsibilities for EPA, Missouri, and the settling defendants. Remaining structures and debris had to be dealt with. Contaminated material had to be excavated and treated. A temporary incinerator had to be built and operated. The land had to be restored. This is the part that can sound technical until you remember what the categories mean. A house is no longer simply a house when a cleanup plan has to decide whether it is a structure, debris, contaminated material, or something that must be handled under a different standard. The temporary incinerator operated in 1996 and 1997. It treated material from Times Beach and other eastern Missouri dioxin sites. EPA's formal closeout record describes testing and on-site disposal of solid treatment residue only after the required treatment levels had been achieved. That wording matters. It rules out the lurid but false image of an untreated poisoned city, simply buried in its own footprint. It also explains why the cleanup cannot be told honestly as a single image of flames. There were structures and debris. There was contaminated soil. There were materials that required treatment. There was residue whose disposition followed testing. Each category carried a different problem, but all of them had grown out of the same larger fact. The inhabited place could no longer stay in place while the response was carried out. The technical record belongs in the story because it measures the distance between a town as people knew it and a site as agencies had to manage it. EPA's public history uses one of the images that made Times Beach famous. Homes, businesses, and the water tower were incinerated, and the remains went into what it calls the town mound. The closeout record gives the larger remedy in more careful pieces: demolition and disposal of structures and debris, excavation, treatment, restoration, and managed residue. Those records are not excuses for what happened. They are the difference between a real history and a horror story silhouette. The distinction does not make the loss smaller. It makes it harder to hide behind a single dramatic picture. A town is not restored because its materials have been sorted correctly. It is not restored because a contaminated soil problem has passed a treatment standard. The federal work could close the environmental case. It could not reassemble the place that had been broken apart in the process. And here the road changes meaning again. At the start, the dust control oil can sound like an obscure technical detail, a grim footnote before the flood takes over the story. It was more than that. The road treatment was the route by which contamination entered the shared physical life of Times Beach. The flood did not invent the danger. It made the consequences impossible to keep local, routine, or invisible. That is the hinge in this story. The town was not abandoned because of some sudden, unknowable curse that descended with the water. A practical convenience had become a boundary. The same streets meant to make daily life more bearable had become part of the evidence explaining why daily life there could not resume. There is no need to assign malice to make that conclusion land. The record does not establish that the town chose poison knowingly. It does establish a sequence of decisions and findings: waste oil on unpaved roads, contamination confirmed after the flood, a recommendation against re-inhabitation, a permanent relocation, then a cleanup designed around what could be removed, treated, restored, or safely managed. The harm does not become less real because no document supplies a satisfying villain. In fact, the absence of that easy villain is part of why the case has lasted. It leaves behind a more uncomfortable fact about shared systems. Things can be arranged for a practical purpose, accepted as routine, and still carry a cost nobody sees clearly until the ground itself forces the accounting. The cleanup did eventually reach its official end. EPA's closeout report says restoration was complete and no further response actions were required. Route 66 State Park opened on former Times Beach land in 1999. EPA later deleted the site from the National Priorities List in 2001. The place should not be described as an active abandoned cleanup emergency because the record says otherwise. As of the current official listings, EPA still records Times Beach as deleted from the National Priorities List, and Missouri State Parks lists the park grounds as open daily year-round, subject to temporary closures. That is the present-day fact. A person can enter ground that used to hold an incorporated town, but access is not the same thing as return, and a maintained public landscape is not the same thing as the life that existed before the buyout. The park does not prove that nothing remains, nor does it prove that the site is hiding an unsolved secret. The core record is remarkably direct. Contaminated waste oil was used to control dust on the town's roads. Flooding and sampling brought the danger into a different scale of public view. Health authorities advised against re-inhabitation. The town was bought out. Its physical remains entered a documented remedy. The land was restored for a new use. The sources used here do not provide a usable primary record of a particular family's departure, what they said at the loudspeakers, what they packed, where they went, or how they remembered it years later. That silence should not be filled with a composite family and a movie scene. The missing voices are a limit of the material, not proof of a cover-up. But the broad human fact remains in plain view. Nearly 2,000 residents were permanently relocated. A town that had roads to settle dust on had a reason to exist as a shared place. When the roads became part of the contamination chain, the loss did not end with the pavement. It reached the possibility of ordinary return. So the final image is not a ghost town behind a fence. It is a road through Route 66 State Park, over land that once held Times Beach. The federal remedy is complete. The ground has another use. Yet the quiet fact under that open landscape is harder to clear away. A route meant to make a town livable became part of the reason the town could no longer be lived in.